It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. They just successfully funded their most recent game, Greg Loring Albright's Keep the Faith, which is a light RPG about the growth of a religion. If you missed the campaign, do keep an eye out for a chance to late pledge in the coming weeks. Also, if you'd like to support Beyond Solitaire, please head to patreon.com/BeyondSolitaire to help me keep the lights on. For now, though, enjoy the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod I have a very special guest. This is Thomas Malaby. He is professor and chair of anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and he's also the adjunct curator of cultural studies at the Milwaukee Public Museum. How you doing today, Thomas?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk today.
Yeah, I'm really pumped to talk to you. So, is the adjunct curator position a new one for you?
Yes, our department, the anthropology department here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has had a very, very, very long-running partnership with the Milwaukee Public Museum, which is a natural history museum here in Milwaukee, and a nationally important one. And we've run a graduate program, graduate certificate in museum studies for around 60 years. And that involved a lot of our archaeologists primarily, sometimes our biological anthropologists, but I'm a cultural anthropologist. But as the museum, I think, has, like most of those museums, sought to grapple with current issues of concern and how material culture and technology affects human experience today, those relationships have built. So I'm more and more involved with what they're doing over there. And they're about to move into a new museum downtown in Milwaukee. It's going to be very beautiful. It's going to open up in a couple of years.
Excellent. All right, so I invited you on the podcast because I read your book, Gambling Life, Dealing in Contingency in a Greek City. So I basically just played a lot of backgammon. Somebody recommended your book to me because there's a chapter about backgammon in there. But for people who are not familiar with that book, why don't you tell us a bit about it? It's some of its earlier work for you now, but
That's right. That's right. It was based on the field research that I did for my dissertation. It was an adaptation of my dissertation and development of it. Boy, there's a lot to say. I mean, I suppose one of the most important things to say is that I grew up in a household where games were really, really important, where we played games all the time. My grandfather was a railroad union organizer in the Depression, but he was also an extremely, extremely good pool player in Central Ohio. He was one of the national pool players playing across the country in their circuit. He's the local guy they would play. And I remember watching him shoot pool after a stroke, and he had lost the use of one hand, and he had fashioned from a coat hanger and felt a bridge so he could continue to shoot pool. And he was just amazing. My father, also a great pool player, and we all learned, and we played a lot of cards. My grandfather, also a great pinochle player. So when we would see my grandparents and just even in our own home, getting out a deck of cards and that being the occasion around holidays, family trips, that was just constant. So that was the interest in games from one angle. But my father was also an engineer at IBM. With a number of patents for them over the years, primarily in optical character recognition. But because of that, we were one of the first families I knew to have an IBM PC. This is sort of just after the Radio Shacks that we saw around. And I was just fascinated by it, and I wanted to play any game I could on it. It was going to the local computer store and searching the floppy disk rack for games you could play, and they were all. This is a green monochrome screen. It didn't have any graphics. It just had characters from the ASCII character set. There was a Star Trek game where you had a little grid and you would go around, and a typing game, which is why actually I pretty fast typist because I was the only games in town were those two. So because of that, I had a long running interest in games. And then when I became interested in anthropology as an undergraduate and on undergraduate school, I was initially very interested in ritual and performance, which has been one of our, I think, most successful topics of study in cultural anthropology. And I was learning as much as I could about that when I read a book by Michael Hertzfeld called The Poetics of Manhood, and then a book by him called Place in History, where he talked sort of in passing in his work on Crete, in cities and the village in Crete. He talked in passing about the coffee houses there and all the games that were played. And that really sparked my interest in an anthropological treatment of games, because we had barely done it. There were only some scattered handlings of it. So I wanted to understand games as a kind of project within anthropology to develop that framework. But I also was excited about the way in which games could reveal something to us about how human beings confront the unpredictable nature of their lives, always in culturally shaped and specific ways, historically specific ways, but to try and look at how human beings know that they live in an uncertain world and that they are facing an uncertain future, and what does their playing of games teach us about those culturally shaped attitudes. So that was the inspiration for the book. Fulbright funded it, barely, I think, because I was studying something illegal, but just barely got through, as I learned later. And then that's a whole other story. And then I went to Hanya and started trying to find the gambling dens there of all kinds, which took some doing. But after about 3 months, I started to be allowed into these places and to see the kinds of gambling that was going on.
Yes, this is one thing I was wondering about as I was reading the book. Actually, it was very funny. Is even if from the start, I was like, this kind of reminds me of like Geertz's notes on a Balinese cockfight, and then he like mentioned it partway in. I was like, oh, there it is.
Yes, yes, yeah. It's ironic, really, because that's a very famous piece, Deep Play, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight, one of the most famous essays in the history of anthropology, and it's about a game. It's about gambling, but he doesn't really treat it as a game. It's kind of my argument. It ends up
Yeah.
being something that, like a ritual, tells a story of how a society likes to tell a story to themselves. So that was also maybe that kind of piece and that kind of treatment was behind my desire to treat games on their own terms.
We will get back to that, but I'm just so curious. How did you choose where to do this project? And then how do you actually manage to put down enough roots in a place to get people to let you see their questionable, sometimes straight up illegal gambling activities?
Right. Well, I'd always been interested in the Eastern Mediterranean. I had taken a course as an undergraduate on ancient Greece. And I was just, maybe it's because I was into mythology as a kid. I played a lot of D&D. There's a lot of cultural imagination stuff maybe behind that interest, but I was very fascinated by it. And when I arrived for my PhD program, I was initially assigned to an advisor, cultural anthropologist, who had done his work in India actually, but was himself Turkish, Nur Yolman. So that's who I thought I was going to be working with, and that was, let's just say we weren't on the same page. He was not a performance theory ritual kind of person, really, in that more modern vein. And I was starting to become a little bit lost. And then Michael Hertzfeld happened to arrive, and he had done his research on Crete, and that was right there. I was interested in Greece or Turkey. So I took a lot of inspiration from that and a lot of mentorship from that. Now, as far as where I chose to do my research, I knew I wanted to do it in Greece. I did a summer language program and traveled around Greece after it ended. The program was in Athens, looking for a city that would be the kind of place with a lot of gambling, and it needs to be large enough for that. And as soon as I walked into Hanya, which is about 100,000 people at the time, I immediately knew this is the place for me. It's also a relatively wealthy part of Greece and Crete because of all of the olive groves and orange groves, especially in that part of the island. So there's a lot of money. So that shows up in the gambling that takes place.
So you noted a couple of times in the book that people were kind of teased you about wanting to watch the games as opposed to play them.
Yeah.
So to what extent did you participate versus observe while collecting notes for
Oh
this?
boy, a lot. So there were many, many hours of playing games. There was many hours of learning backgammon, which is one of my very favorite games. They play 3 different games with the backgammon set, whereas people who learn it in the States tend to only play one. They play that one, but they play 2 others, which are have more skill in them. So a lot of playing a backgammon, a lot of playing cards. There were 3 brothers who owned a very small hotel with a cafe in the first floor in the old city of Kanya. And, I was just sort of walking around, who could I talk to, right? And I met this guy who was one of the brothers who usually did the morning through afternoon shift, Angelis. And he just, I think, took me under his wing in many ways. Didn't speak a word of English, which was helpful, and for me to get up to speed on the language, and taught me the card games, taught me backgammon, taught me many of them. And then when I would go to these places, I would play if I could. A number of them that I talk about in the book they're already structured for participation in important ways. So, for example, the clubs, as they're called, are places where couples go and play as couples, certain kinds of higher stakes, sort of bridge-like gambling games. And I was alone, so that wasn't a place where I was going to be able to participate. But I got to play a lot of the card games, poker, and Zarya a little bit. But that was to get a sense of how the games worked and what was the relationship between how Greeks talk about the unpredictabilities that they face in the games and how they talk about unpredictabilities elsewhere in their lives, and to sort of, from my own point of view, experience that and understand the rhythm of that.
So how much Fulbright money did you gamble? No, John, that
was always the joke, right? Yeah, it was a bit of a strange thing. People used to ask, do I have a line item, gambling losses or something like that. But I most often played for drinks and things like that. But my advisor was very smart about this. He had a line item in all of his budgets called obligatory hospitality, which is a wonderful phrase. And basically it was a way to justify to whatever university administration that, look, if you're somewhere doing research, you should also be paying for drinks sometimes and paying for coffees and treating people to meals, right? So that's the obligatory part of it. And essentially I was, what was often on the line was who was going to be the hospitable one at the end of the game.
All right, so you've talked a bit about uncertainty and how people respond to that in life, and I've noticed across multiple articles of yours, you use the term contingency very specifically.
Yes.
So I guess, is that just the academic term for talking about these things, and what does that encompass at this point?
Yeah, it's a real challenge in the academy because you end up in a position when you develop concepts for analysis where you need them to be precise. You need them to not lead to perhaps misinterpretations, misunderstandings. And that it can be tricky because sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder. When anthropologists started studying ritual, it was something everybody did, but people didn't talk about rituals as an activity they did as a category. Oh, I'm going to be doing some rituals this weekend. I'm going to go to a wedding. And then on Monday, I'm going to go to the DMV. They don't talk about rituals as a category. So it was kind of an open space for anthropologists to make that concept their own and make it workable. Whereas games, boy, do people talk about games. They talk about their playing of games, and they talk about the uncertainties in games and the risks and all of that stuff. So that language is very freighted around games. And in order to carve out language that would be precise for the purposes of social science research, we often have to take a step back from the most common lay terms or be very careful in how we define them if we use a word like game. So contingency is a good example of that. Often people will talk about uncertainty, right? And what they mean is unpredictability or indeterminacy or contingency. But uncertainty is not knowing if something's going to happen. That's not the same thing as whether something is uncertain out in the world, right? Whether it is actually indeterminate. So unpredictability, indeterminacy, contingency are all interchangeable. So at least to give your reader some relief, you can move between them. But contingency is the one that philosophers most often use to differentiate it from what's determined, or they would say necessary. So you have necessity and contingency. And necessity are the things that have to happen, and contingency are the things that could go one way or the other. And that's not strictly speaking just randomness, because there's other sources of how things can go the other way, right? If I make the wrong guess about your point of view, that's not about randomness. That's about the social contingency between us, right? Or if I go to make a shot in a basketball game and I miss, which is probably very likely, that is not randomness, and it's not that kind of social contingency. It's actually what I would call performative contingency. So there's a number of those different sources of how our lives feel open-ended and contingent. And I developed sort of a language and a framework for helping us talk about that as social scientists. And part of the reason for that gets right back to gambling, because games have a different array and calibration of these different sources of contingency. Poker relies a lot on social contingency, right? And to a certain extent on the randomness, the stochastic contingency of a deck of cards. And they're all in there, performative contingency too. But by contrast, something like backgammon may still have some social contingency, but quite a bit less, because everything's right there on the board to see. Your resources are as plain as day as mine, right? So my framework was intended to get us thinking about the various sources of unpredictability, not just in games, but in our lives, and the different games that we play in any cultural context. Do they generate different ways of talking about those indeterminacies? And what do we learn from that especially when they link a particular game to a particular domain of their lives, their business, their romantic relationships, their politics, and all that?
So when you talk about looking at games as games, but also, we've had this like kind of wider ranging set of connections between games and other parts of life. What do you mean when you say that, and how does it distinguish what you're trying to do from other anthropological work?
Oh, sure. Well, from my interest in games really owes a lot to anthropology in the sense I referenced before, when we undertook to identify ritual and also bureaucracy. We could also say theater, but I'll talk primarily about ritual. We developed kind of along the way, but also because of some really smart people who saw this, an approach that said, hey, this thing, ritual, is a cultural form. It can appear in a lot of different places. But wherever it appears, there's an institution behind it. There's some kind of social institution, a formal institution like a church, or an informal institution like a family that has their ritual gatherings, a national institution. There's always an institution sponsoring rituals. And those institutions are looking to accomplish something through those rituals. Now, they may not be successful, but it's often something like belonging and legitimacy, especially for things like nation states and churches. So that approach to cultural forms, ritual, bureaucracy, theater, highlights the fact that they are an available framework for institutions to use to accomplish their projects. So when I came to the study of games, I was very much steeped in that. And it was very obvious to me, even as someone who loves games, that the academic treatment and the popular conception, especially in Western societies, of games was really shot through with a player-focused, individual account of games. Now that has a very freighted history in modernism, the modern individual, the choosing self. Everything is a rational choice that we make, John Locke, and a whole bunch of ideas that have informed the woodwork of what the Western Academy for many, many years. So what I wanted to do was develop a definition of games and a framework for handling them that let us understand not only how games teach us how people experience and confront indeterminacy in and across domains, but also be available for use to study how institutions are using games. To what end are they using those games? What are they trying to accomplish through them? Now that is what makes my treatment of games pretty different from the popular conception. But from my point of view, it opens up a lot of exciting territory for exploring those connections across what's happening in a game and what's happening outside of it, for one thing, because we shouldn't treat those things as separate. A game is not a special set apart place like any domain of our lives. We're jumping back and forth. We're managing the boundary. We're establishing the boundary. It does that for us. And it also gets us talking about when not necessarily a game, strictly speaking, but game design elements are a part of the world that we experience. And that's increasingly true. Through digitally networked technologies, game design is being used to inform a lot of the technologies we take our actions through, right? And they're looking to capture our attention actually through them as part of my argument. So that's as short as I can put it, I suppose, for where
No, that's good. So there are two branching paths we go here, but I'm gonna hop back before we hop into technology. So,
Okay.
we talked briefly before this interview about the magic circle, and I feel like we've hit the point where it's time to talk about it because you mentioned like there's no such thing as a game that's like separate from what's actually happening in your culture, in your
Right.
life. Also, I 100% still hold grudges from things people have done to me in games. So magic circle,
Right.
mine, no kidding. But
Right. Well, it's not that the impetus behind the concept is misguided, because boundary maintenance is an extremely important part of how games are managed, how they come to be. But the concept kind of developing in its own corner and without a connection to the traditions of social science thought, where we were already talking about boundary maintenance by institutions and otherwise, because it kind of developed on its own, it opened the door for treating that boundary maintenance in games as if it really is its own thing and it's special and, worst of all, automatic. As if, as soon as you're playing a game, this thing is going on, rather than seeing it as a social project, a cultural accomplishment when it happens, right? As you found, you play games, you hold grudges, right? That establishment of some kind of semi-bounded, I would say, distinction between any given domain of our experience, but for a game, and the other arenas of our experience is never hermetically sealed. And in fact, often those things are jumbled together. We want them jumbled together. When a professional sports team is associated with a locale, with a city, with a state, and is competitive and going late into the season, in the playoffs, contending for a championship, that is about the identity of that region. It's bound up in it, right? What makes professional sports often interesting is not just the game itself, but the stories around it. What a player has overcome in order to be in the position that they're in. So it's always been a bit strange that the Academy has done this. I know where it came from, and it came from Johann Huizinga and Homo Ludens. But interestingly, even in that book, he contradicts any strict treatment of the magic circle. Later on, he's talking about the play element, and he says culture starts in a play element and it never leaves it. That's a lot more productive if we want to appreciate human beings' ability to always be ready to move laterally and across domains and frustrate rigid categories, which they do.
Indeed. Speaking of, I actually think this leads really nicely into talking about some of your later work in looking at games in a more digital setting. Because you're absolutely right. Games and gamification and, the way that even just basic apps on our phones and stuff work, they take stuff from games so that things that were in the quote magic circle of I'm going to play a game now are actually now very much embedded into our lives. So how did you go from studying a small town in Greece to, your second book, which is about Second Life?
Well, right. So I had mentioned before that technology was a big part of my life growing up. Through my college years and in grad school in the 90s, I was the guy in the dorm who knew how to fix the Windows computer. I knew how to dig into the back end of it and make all that stuff work, even though I wasn't studying or taking classes and that stuff. I was just very connected to it and very interested in it. So, of course, video games, computer games, consoles. We had an Atari, actually, even before we had that PC. And then computer games in the 90s especially, I found just terribly fascinating. I'm also a huge fan of tabletop role-playing games, and I've played Dungeons and Dragons since I was a kid in the 70s, first edition. So when that became an available thing to do on a computer, when I didn't have a gaming group for that sort of thing, then that was very, very exciting for me. So there was a moment, though, I mean, all that's background, but there was an actual moment when I was in this very building, different office, but I was in this building. I'd gotten my job at UW in Milwaukee. I had wrapped up my first book, and I was looking at the Google homepage, the famously Spartan Google homepage, and it still has, I believe, I don't go there, I guess, that often anymore, but it has two buttons, right? It has the search bar, and then it has search, and then it has I'm feeling lucky. Now, it doesn't do this anymore because the ad revenue, it would sacrifice ad revenue, but that I'm feeling lucky button, I just looked at that. I just written a book about a particular culture's way of talking about and confronting indeterminacy and luck. There are multiple conceptions of luck, multiple words for things that we would call luck. We're very much a part of that. And I see this button that says, I'm feeling lucky. That's interesting. And back then, before they changed it, if you clicked that button after typing in a search string, it would take you directly to the first search result. You would not see a list of search results. It would just take you right to that page, right? And to me, that was fascinating. What is Google saying about luck here? They're saying that there's an alignment of a sort if this works for you. They're saying that your ability, your performative contingency, your ability to come up with the search string in your head of what you should type into that search bar. The social contingency of the guesswork, right, that's also involved in that. All of the actions of everyone building web pages and all the links that they're building, and then Google's algorithm crawling through them and developing ranks, right, that all of those are in alignment. And that struck me as almost a kind, very anthropological, certainly, but it reminded me of, the idea of a state of grace, even all the way back to the Puritans, right? Yeah, everything fits. You are connected to this system in an important way. So that got me thinking about what's going on here. What is contingency to the experience of digitally networked technologies? What kinds of meanings are being generated through it? So I knew I wanted to work with a company that was designing an online or a computer game, at least, if not an online computer game. And so I began putting that together and applying to the National Science Foundation and got funded. And I happened to meet the people who were the principals at Linden Lab. Now, thank God, because most of the companies who design computer games and the like are not exactly very open to academics most of the time. But they were at Linden Lab. They were very excited about their project. And it was even more fascinating for me because they were not designing a game, but they were using game design elements all through that project. It was very much informed by game design in important ways. So that's how I ended up working with the folks at Linden Lab for about a year and a half. I was there.
So, how did embedding yourself into, I guess, kind of an office game dev culture differ from what you had done before, where you actually traveled to another place, you learned another language, and
Right.
had to
It was
dig?
it was much more institutionally structured. There were boundaries on it in a different way, right? So there were at Hanya, in the gambling dens in Hanya, I was studying a city and trying to get a handle on that city and games there, and by extension, fair or not, Cretan or Greek attitudes toward indeterminacy. Whereas with Linden Lab, by extension was really Silicon Valley in that era, right? But you have so much to do if you want to understand an institution on its terms, because its framework is such a dominating part of the lives of the people who work for that company, that it was very different, right? It was navigating a bureaucratic structure. But interestingly, because they were a tech company in the post-World War II America, they were also trying to deny any vertical elements to their organization and say that they were a horizontal organization where everyone got to choose their own work. So that created to me, surprising but fascinating tension in the company as well.
Interesting. So you've looked at Second Life. You've also, very clearly over the course of later work, developed an interest in digital games and I guess like digital communities or worlds.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I do regard them with some suspicion and fear, to be real. But
Oh, really? Okay, interesting.
but when you study a digital world, I mean, yeah, I think that we have lots of conversations now about like, but it's not real, but you need to connect to your own life. Like I remember reading so many articles about people whose second life became their real life.
Yeah.
Um, so as an anthropologist, I mean, d- is there any change in the tools that you use to study these places?
Oh,
And
boy.
how is the field like treating them right now?
I think for anthropology specifically in the academy, we are coming up to speed on it now, a little later than I would have liked. Developing field research methodologies for highly mediated, technologically mediated social action was always difficult, right? So before digital technologies and the internet, if we want to think back to an era of phones and shortwave, landline phones and shortwave radio and television stations, radio broadcasts, newspapers, those were always media through which people were doing important things, and there were important things at stake, but you don't get to just sit somewhere and see that social action in front of you, right? And see it unfold. It's distributed and it's asynchronous, as we would say now. So that was always creating some challenges, and I think part of what anthropology did was a little bit of a retreat. I mean, there were some great people trying to do work in those areas, but a retreat to the face-to-face and the small scale and the village and those kinds of places. But now, I think it's very clear we don't have that luxury anymore. So developing the tools to look at human experience when it's so saturated with digital affordances is very difficult. One of the things that guides my training of my graduate students, my PhD students especially, who do kind of full-length ethnographic research, is to remember that one of our strengths as a discipline has always been this element of our methodology that we call participant observation, right? We were talking about the fact that I was observing games, but I was also playing them. And what participant observation does really, really well is give the academy, not just anthropology, a window into social practice, what people do, their habits. Now, when people report on what they do, when you ask them why they do things, they're not very accurate, right? I think there was one of the famous early anthropologists said something like an oceanic gulf separates what people do from what they say they do, right? So that methodology was always very, very good at capturing that dimension of human action, where there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of consequences from that social action in social practice. How do we do that in digitally mediated contexts? I think we have learned how to, first of all, treat a lot of the typed communication, recorded communication that circulates on forums and in virtual world, social media, as its own kind of action. I mean, words are not just describers of things. They don't just represent the world. We actually accomplish things by saying things, right? There's a famous set of lectures called How to Do Things with Words about that, right? And I think digital technologies have foregrounded a lot of what are called representational technologies like writing and video and audio. So we have to look at that with an action-oriented perspective and treat it performatively the same way in many respects we would treat someone walking across a room and slamming a tray down on a table, right? We have to be ready to see it as social action. There's more to it. I don't want to we probably don't have time to get into the technical details, but you have to contend with the fact that a lot of communication online is one-to-one, what we used to call one-to-one phone calls, right? Person-to-person phone calls, where you wouldn't be charged for the call way back in the day of the early phone system if you didn't reach the person you were trying to reach, right? That was person to person. Well, that's how a lot of communication happens through digital technologies now. Direct messaging, right? Text messaging, and the like. How do we handle that as anthropologists? It's challenging, but people have done good work. And not just anthropologists, ethnographic work by people like T.L. Taylor, who to me is the preeminent ethnographer of our digital lives. And every book she's done has been tremendous, right? So that would be someone I would point to.
Excellent. So how do I ask this question? I've just been sitting here wondering about it, so I'll just ask. So before we got officially started recording this conversation, you mentioned that you also had you're part of a certificate in digital cultures, and we're talking about ethnographers online. We're talking about studying human habits. I guess my biggest question about how would you study a virtual community is that so we're all kind of embedded in different contexts. This is true. I think that I make very specific assumptions about how I should proceed with my life because I'm an American. I grew up in Texas. I have a very specific cultural and economic background, and society puts things in place that seem natural, but we're following pathways that have been kind of worn by many previous generations. But when you're looking at digital culture, how do you determine which human habits are really our habits and which are conditioned by the company or the creator of the digital product? Because I feel like when you look at a digital artifact, you're looking at two things, right? You're looking at the reaction of the person, but you're also looking at the sculpting of the actual game world in order to elicit those reactions.
This is one of my primary areas of interest, and especially my recent writing. I guess I would start by suggesting that we don't want to draw too hard of a distinction between any of our habits, our repeated practices, our competencies, and the idea of something being constructed for us. Because everything we learned how to do, how to walk, how to ride a bike, how to write, were inculcated in us, by people who taught us how to do things. We learned often through mimesis, by observing people and following how they do things. There's some wonderful examples out there of this kind of thing. Body and Soul, which is about a boxing gym on the south side of Chicago by Loic Walcott, is a great example of this. Learning how to remake your body in order to be a boxer will shape how you move through the world, right? So I think we were always already having our habits, our practices shaped by the institutions around us. But you're right to point out that we belong to an increasing in number array of meaningful communities of practices, they're sometimes called. That can be dizzying, right? It was always true, even in small-scale human societies before massive industrialization and capitalism. It was always true, even in those societies, that there were multiple domains of life, right? Multiple affiliations that people had to their age cohort, right? To a gender identity, however defined, to a number of, to one locale versus another, a whole bunch of different distinctions, right? But right now, those distinctions are multiplied enormously, and they're, again, distributed, right? So digital cultures, to get back to that term, is not meant to suggest that there are cultures that are online and then there are cultures that are not online, but rather to get us to think a bit more about the way the digital dimension is shaping all of our cultural experience. And those cultural experiences are always multiple. We belong to multiple cultural contexts, each of us, cultural domains. Now, that getting back to the point you concluded on, right, which these things are constructed for us, how do we take them? It's a great question. Why do we end up taking some dimension of the architectures that we use as natural? We stop thinking about it, stop questioning it, take it for granted, right? Sometimes I've heard culture defined as everything that goes without saying, right? So when do we treat the architectures through which we move as things that go without saying? Now that is in some ways a very old question. If we think about something like a road system or a built environment, those are infrastructures or architectures that we just take to be the background natural context for the action that we make. But the thing to notice about those built environments and infrastructures is that they are incredibly expensive to change. They are durable, and they require a lot of moving of material to shape them. And you got to do a major renovation on a building, that's a big ask, right? So the design decisions, and I think the anthropology of design is a really exciting area to think about. The design decisions behind those kinds of architectures and infrastructures are shaped by that investment and the durability and the time, right? But if we start thinking about digitally mediated or digitally even born or digitally saturated infrastructures, right? A phone is a material object, I guess what I'm saying here. It's not just digital stuff, right? But so much of it is shaped by digital architectures. Well, those digital architectures, which we also easily take to be natural, right, and shape how we do things, they can be changed very, very cheaply. They can be updated. You can have Copilot AI appear in the browser you opened yesterday, or the word processor you opened yesterday, where it wasn't, and today it's there, right? Because a decision was made somewhere else, and that is a sweeping change to your digital infrastructure that can be tried out as a gambit for you and for millions of other users. And if it doesn't quite work the way it's intended, it can be changed the next day. Those moves that are made by institutions, which can so quickly and so easily alter their commitments on one front or another, mean that it is vastly easier, I think, for those institutions to shape our expectations, to shape our habits, to get us locked in, to grab our eyeballs and get us doom scrolling, make use of the wonderful work and insights of someone like Natasha Dow-Schul, but make use of the technology she studied in the production of video game and video poker and video slot machines. How do they command attention? Press after press of the button, nickel after nickel of the slot. That is game design behind the taken for granted architectures of our digital lives.
Yeah, that's really interesting way to talk about it. And as we're talking about digital cultures, the other thing has been, I guess, I think it's probably on everybody's mind who like uses social media, right? Is I would take like Twitter, now X, as an example of like, I guess, an interesting tear between the people who feel that they do the culture on a site and therefore have ownership on it versus an actual physical owner. It actually kind of makes me think of actually all the way back to gambling life, because you have people in Greece who are playing their games kind of under the radar. They've got their own like little private gambling cultures, and then you've got people who choose to engage with the lottery and
Right.
with state gambling. Um, and so, I mean, I guess, yeah, let's go back to that. What did that initial
Absolutely.
research teach you about how people understand engaging with like official or like institutional gaming or gaming that's owned or controlled by somebody else versus what they think they own themselves.
Right. The work on Greece, I didn't realize when I wrote the first book, I'd never come across the specific history of it. I wrote about it in a later piece, that the development of the state-sponsored lottery was initially something that grew out of the very beginnings of the Greek Republic after the Greek Civil War, right? So that was in the early 1950s. The oldest of those state-sponsored games is Propo, which is a soccer gambling game. And the idea is that you will get a card for the week with a set of select matches from different leagues, from very famous leagues to more and more obscure leagues, right? And you have to try and pick the winner or a tie for every one of those matches. And then that gets fed into an algorithm that the state had made use of. Now, from when institutions play games, there's an expression in Greece, mas παίζουν παιχνίδια, they're playing games with us, right? Captures this idea very well. When the state plays Propo, it's not playing the same game as the citizens. It's trying to establish an algorithm that will pay out properly, right? That will make them money, but also incent participation from the winners. So that's one of the big lessons of any kind of formally institutionally sponsored gambling, whether it's casino gambling or state gambling, nationally sponsored gambling, is that at that point, it's very different from, say, a hosting fee, as you might call it. So most of the gambling coffee houses that I did research in, once an hour, you were paying the proprietor for the time to play the game. Whereas institutions, when they can structure participation in those games, but also architect the actual algorithms and systems behind how that games generate the contingencies that engage their players, they stand in a different position. Now, for the Greeks, there was this strange inversion, you could say, between, and probably still is, you could say, between their relationship with the Greek state and their paying of taxes and their participation, for those who did, in the state-sponsored gambling, not just the soccer game, but also state-sponsored lotteries and scratch ticket games. And it had to do with the fact that they don't trust the Greek state. The United States, for those who live in the United States is a little odd in the way in which its idea of it as a nation and its political institution are the same thing. They were born basically the same time. But if you're a country like Greece, and many, many other countries are like this too, the idea of your nation, the Greek nation, has only an arbitrary and contrived, to many in Greece, relationship with this particular constitutional arrangement running the country right now, right? So there's a very contentious and rebellious relationship with the Greek state, which goes back to a bunch of Greek history and the history under the Ottoman Empire and other important parts where a kind of resistance and rebellion was very rampant across the current territory of what is modern day Greece. But so this resistance against the state means that there's a lot of tax evasion in Greece. And for them, it's a game in a way, right? But it's an inverse game from participating in the state lotteries. And gamblers would say to me, when they mention maybe they don't pay their taxes, actually it was, sorry, let me restate that. And gamblers would mention to me, when we talked about their losses, and I would ask them about them, they would say, well, those are my taxes. I don't pay any the normal way anyway. So there was a very complicated relationship, but I think the idea that a nation state is going to run gambling and offer to its citizens these opportunities to get ahead has been there's some great books about it, but it's been an under-examined aspect of nation state history. In fact, the Greek protests in, I'm going to get the year wrong, I want to say something like 2011, right around the time of Greek austerity, and there were massive protests in Greece, began at the lottery stores for reasons I talk about in one of my pieces. So there's a charged relationship between the state and games like this. There's a wonderful book by Amy Chaskel about an underground lottery in Brazil that's been running since the 1800s. It was started by a baron who owned a zoo, and it was a numbers game essentially. People would walk around with a sheet with numbers on it, and every number had an animal, so the numbers became associated with the different animals in the zoo, just to market the zoo. And people would pay their money and pick a number, and if their number came in the drawing, they would win money. And that became the basis for the underground economy of Brazil, and was the focus of national efforts to quash it for many, 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 many years, as she writes about. So there's this fraught relationship between games of chance and institutions. And from a player's point of view, I'll just conclude by saying this. From a player's point of view, there's always the chance that a game's legitimacy, the legitimacy of its indeterminate outcomes, will be undermined because of its institutional control. That always raises the question of whether the fix is in, right? Whether that institution is cheating behind the scenes. Whereas our local games are governed, they also need to be legitimate, but the questions of whether there's cheating are monitored in much more direct ways, typically.
Interesting. So, kind of speaking of sports betting, one of the most striking, amusing, maybe a little concerning things I read in your book was you discussing two guys just kind of sitting around having a drink and watching flies and like making bets on whether they would land on particular pieces of fruit.
Yes.
And I mean, good Lord. But what do you, I guess, do you have any opinions about, or have you been considering things like DraftKings now, where people can really bet on not only the outcome of sports games, but of many, many sort of micro things within a game? And, what does that say about us based on what you know about gambling, and how should we approach that?
I think it's an area of really, really great concern to me. There's a book called Selling Hope about state lotteries from the 80s. And it's one of many critical works on state-sponsored gambling that makes the point that when people are caught up in an economically disadvantageous situation, and often with respect to dire circumstances, a medical bill comes in, often their only hope will be to try and win the lottery. And there's something terribly tragic about that, right? And especially when you think about the fact that that lottery is offered by the state, right? So someone in a vulnerable position, and we don't have political institutions, except for at least some level of responsibility for protecting us from vulnerabilities, whether they be natural disasters or house fires or any of a number of other things that are supposed to be services provisioned to counteract those things. So when people are in desperate circumstances, they will turn to these kinds of mechanisms. But the development of sports gambling has taken that to a different level. And I think the element of, it's a combination, let me say that again, let me restate that. The development of sports gambling has taken all of that to a different level. And I see it as a combination of the rise of technologies that can command our attention, as I was mentioning before, the scrollable media driven by algorithms that resemble video poker and video slot machines. It's almost endless how an interface for any given app can be improved to make it reach out to that deeply human aspect of our experience that makes us want to pay attention when there's unpredictability, and pay attention when there's pattern, especially if the balance between those is just right, just enough to be fascinating, right? And for us to think about, maybe if I do this action, I'll see a change like this in the pattern. If I do that action. At the same time, these kinds of sports betting systems, including Propo in Greece, were always in part about gender identity, about the demonstration of mastery. And in many countries in the Western tradition, cultures of the West, shall we say, and others too, masculinity very frequently gets bound up with ideas of demonstrating mastery, especially of complex systems. I know soccer, so I'm going to fill this out, and you're going to fill yours out, and we're going to debate, but we're going to see who knows this game better. And if I win, then I know soccer better than any other player in this country, kind of idea. DraftKings, these kinds of technologies are very much tied to ideas of the demonstration of mastery. And that's been a big part of gaming history. There's an incredible book by Carly Kokurik called Coin-Operated Americans. And Carly is an historian, and it's about the video game arcade of the 70s, which is when I was a kid and going to video game arcades, loving them. And her argument is the subtitle, Rebooting Boyhood at the American Arcade. And in that era, this post-war United States era, masculinity is increasingly defined not by mastery over large machines, kind of gross motor skill related stuff, agricultural, factory, heavy stuff, and increasingly defined by still mastery, but over fine motor skills, command of complex systems. Think of the NASA engineers and the celebration of them as a kind of masculinity. The engineer working for a big corporation, GE, IBM, and the way in which they are someone who is demonstrating their masculinity by knowing how to manipulate and innovate in a complex environment. Carly Kokurik shows that the video game arcades of the 70s are about a very similar set of projects for these players. And they, as you would predict, get celebrated. They get celebrated nationally. They're on the cover. The high scores for all of these different games are being recorded at an Iowa video game arcade. People are calling in and telling the high score someone got on Galaga or whatever it was. And those people they're gathered in Iowa, and Life magazine takes a photo of all of them. And it's all boys. And they shoot it like a varsity team. They even get cheerleaders from the local high school to dress up as cheerleaders and pose around these video game players, right? So the gender angle on this is so obvious and important, right? So getting back to the question of these sports betting concerns, I think they are profiting massively on both the innovations of technology to command our attention that all of us are experiencing, along with the game of being masculine that's been in place in the West for a long time. And then layered onto that, a lot of loneliness and economic disadvantage that are reported when people study men, right? Lack of close relationships, lack of social connection. And I think those companies have stepped into that breach.
Interesting, concerning. It'll be really interesting to see how it all kind of plays out in the future. All right, I have one more kind of hard question before I ask you a couple softies. And by hard, I mean I guess rude, but I don't mean it that way. So just for context, I wrote my dissertation about Coptic monks. I am no stranger to the ostensibly impractical, but I feel like in our current culture, especially as we talk about grants and not wasting money, et cetera, et cetera. I know there are people who say, "Oh, a Fulbright to go gamble in Greece." Like, "Oh, it was a National Science
National
Foundation,
Science Foundation.
grant to go hang out at a company and watch a video game get developed." Why is this work important? And what can we do to engage with it more and kind of help appreciate it?
Right. I think it's a great question. I think we should always be ready to answer those kinds of questions. I view the Academy and its long tradition at its best as the place where we rigorously try to answer the questions that we have about the world, about society, about ourselves. And of course, one can always find some odd examples of research projects which make one scratch one's head. But I think any research on games is relatively easy to communicate the importance of its relationship to the things we're curious about, to people out there in the world. And that's simply because games increasingly saturate our experience. And you can make the argument in strictly economic terms very easily just by pointing to how much money is in the game industry. If you consider both computer and analog games, we're talking about something that is much larger than the film industry, for example. That's a lot of money. And where the money is where people's meaningful experiences often are. So what's going on there? And why has it grown the way it has? Those, I think, are really good questions. For the Greece work, I think as well, it comes back to what's meaningful. For Greeks, what happens at the gaming table is culturally meaningful. It's something they talk about. It's something that is part of the currency of their social relations. So if we were to ignore that, we would be ignoring a big part of what makes their lives meaningful to them. More to the point, when we look at how, in any given cultural context, people confront the contingencies of their experience, maybe things like terrible diagnoses in medicine, or accidents, or natural disasters, any of these dramatic contingencies which call for social support and create real challenges for meaning. People ask questions like, why me, right? We need to do a good job of being in a position to understand where their language for those things come from. Where else do they use that language? How does their attitude toward this thing that they face maybe reflect something we could see when the shit is not going down? When someone is not facing a terrible tragedy, but they are facing the contingencies of a game, they will, because we're cultural people, cultural beings, they will display the same kinds of habits and talk about things in similar terms. So that would be how I would talk about how this research can help us. And then on top of that, I think it's pretty easy to point out, and we're all pretty aware of, I think you even referenced it before, increasing concern about how social media and mobile devices, digitally networked technologies are commanding our attention and shaping attitudes and habits, and perhaps getting in the way of meaningful social connections. And I think games are a big part of that. Game design is a big part of that.
Excellent. All right, so now you get a couple softy questions at the end. So you mentioned you love to play games. Have you played anything recently that you really enjoyed?
Boy, well, I've just started DMing a new campaign in Dungeons & Dragons set in the Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign setting from the Dungeon Dudes, Monty Martin, Dr. Monty Martin, also recently got his PhD, and Kelly McLaughlin, which I just am super excited about. I think it's a wonderful setting. What I really like about it is that it's a world without the clear hero answer where everyone's going to solve every problem. So it's a cosmic horror setting, so that's really fun. I play console games quite regularly, sometimes almost meditatively, right? Just to, take a break from things during the day. So Hades is wonderful for that. I think it's beautifully designed game and rich in content, but also incredibly replayable. So I like that one very much. We will try out new board games from time to time. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but my son and his fiance brought this game, which is a very, very distinctive board. It's like a color palette. It's like paint swatches, a whole bunch of boxes of different tones of color, and then you get a card, and you basically can use a word to describe the color you see on the card without using the name of the color, and then people try to, like an object that has that color, and people put their tokens guessing where on the board your color must be. And that was just wonderful. I love games that invite us to be social in that way. It's the reason games like Pictionary or charade type games, I think, are so popular, right? They get us performing for each other in this gentle and open-ended way.
Awesome. Are you talking perhaps about hues and cues?
Hues and cues.
I used Google to try. So
It's got to be it. It was really, really fun. My children are often bringing games to me that I don't know about. That's how I played Exploding Kittens for the first time, and what's the Tokyo one with all the
King of Tokyo?
King of Tokyo.
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff we've played over the years and just had a great deal of fun with. But usually they ask me for the holidays to DM for them. So I've been DMing one shots. Actually, it's no longer a one shot, but once a year we get together and they each are playing a different character from the movie Rise of the Guardians, which is got like a Santa type character and an Easter Bunny type character and all these things. They love that movie. So I've been kind of depowering those heroes and putting them in the Middle Ages, and they're slowly trying to work up to fight the big baddie pitch at the end. So that should be fun.
Oh, that's so fun. And if people want to follow your work online, where do you like to be found?
Yeah, so I have a webpage, thomasmalaby.net. It's set up as a blog. Again, while I'm chair, things are very difficult to find time for that kind of thing. We also have our collaboratory, the Digital Cultures Collaboratory. You can find that with a quick Google search at UWM. In addition, most of my published work that can be freely available is on my academia.edu page. So that's a place where you can find a lot of my work. Felt very fortunate to be able to open, publish, make available my chapter called The Digitally Natural, which is from the Routledge Companion to Media Anthropology that just came out either last year or the year before. And that's one where I talk about a number of these ideas about how we take our digital environment to be beyond question.
Excellent. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on the show. I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I'm really grateful for your time.
It's a lot of fun, Liz. Thanks for the opportunity, and you can find me online.
Absolutely. All right, everybody out there, you know what to do. Please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.